Welcome to Opinionated here on I24 News, the show that challenges consensus, analyzes the events that shape our world, and draws out the views of our guests for the consideration of you, the viewing audience. I'm your host, Benjamin Anthony, CEO of the Miriam Institute. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by opinion columnist for the New York Times, Bret Stephens. His recent address on the state of world Jewry challenged the listeners to examine how best to respond to the harsh reality that, as he put it, we, the Jewish people, that is, have the honor of being hated. Thereafter, I'll be joined in studio by Dan Perry, former AP chief for the Middle East, Europe, and Africa, to chew the fat over one or two of the issues of the day here in Israel. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Bret Stephens.
Nice to see you again, Ben.
So I want to talk today about your presentation at the 92nd Street Y, your speech at the 92nd Street Y. And in there, you mentioned very, very clearly that you are of the belief that we have the honor of being hated. And I wanted to start by asking you, was there a particular moment, as we've seen this steady and alarming rise of Jew hatred, which made you realize that we, all of the collectives, all the various strands of diaspora and Israeli Jewry, have the singular honor of being hated?
Actually, it occurred to me on the 8th of October when I witnessed, as a journalist, a demonstration in Times Square, essentially cheering the mass murder of the previous day. And the people in the demonstration all struck me as people who probably had advanced degrees in the humanities. And they had a look of ecstasy on their faces. I sensed then that essentially a constellation of despicable people, of the perfidious, what I called in my speech, the perfidious, the despotic, the hypocritical, the cynical, and the deranged, were enthusiastic about the mass murder of Jews, and that's, I think, where the idea germinated with me.
And so one of the things that you prescribed, or you prescribed several things, but there was a through line, which was that the Jewish people, as you said, should perhaps take this as a moment to stop caring and begin building their own institutions. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu was very strongly criticized here in Israel, you'll probably recall, for giving a speech in which he invoked the notion that Israel needs to turn into a Spartan nation, a nation essentially that stands on its own. I wanted to ask you how you would differentiate your prescriptions from that. In other words, that Jews build up their institutions, including the media. I'd love to hear more about how you think they can do that, the Jewish media, the Jewish press, but do not fall prey to becoming isolated and insulated, and they don't strike down that wonderful aspect of being the Jewish people, namely to provide robust social comment outside, beyond the walls of the Jewish community.
Well, my memory of the Prime Minister's remark is that he meant it a little more expansively, and that the quote about Sparta was taken out of context. My thought is this: tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in the Jewish world are today dedicated to what I think is essentially a hopeless task, which is fighting anti-Semitism. People will either like the Jews or they will not like the Jews, and I think there's very little in the so-called fight against anti-Semitism that makes much of a difference. I think what the Jewish people can do is essentially replicate what the state of Israel has done, which is to depend on its own resources, to build up its own identity, to create a sense of pride and meaning, and to turn Jewishness into a locus of identity, affiliation, and passion. One of the differences between Israel and American Jewry is right now, Israel is the great center of Jewish creativity, resilience, pride. It is the kind of the sun in terms of what Jewish life is about. Here in the United States, we face a very different situation in which too many young Jews, especially young American Jews, going to places like Columbia. I see the images on your screen of campus protests, have a very weak sense of what their Jewish identity stands for, other than that Jews were victimized in the Holocaust. And when you don't have a kind of a positive sense of what Jewish life should be about, it's no surprise that you invest all of your identity in a sense of victimhood. The purpose of Jewish life is not to replicate a history of victimization. It's to end a history of victimization. And so Jews have to move towards a much more positive vision of what Jewish life can be. Just to give you one example, Ben, the overwhelming majority of Jewish parents do not send their kids to Jewish day schools because most Jewish day schools are unaffordable and they're not readily available. And yet Jewish philanthropists are spending hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars posting ads in the Super Bowl, which don't move the needle at all. So let's change the locus or the focus of Jewish efforts to build a much stronger, much more positive vision of Jewish identity, other than Tikkun Olam and Schindler's List.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, quite frankly. One of the organizations that you spoke about during that presentation, albeit in the questions and answers session that followed your prepared remarks, was the ADL. And it's caused, obviously, a back and forth within the Jewish space in the United States about the virtues or lack of virtue that one should attach to the work of the ADL and its effectiveness, really. What made you decide to pinpoint specific organizations and why the ADL in particular?
Well, that came about somewhat happenstantially. There was a question and answer session with Rabbi David Ingber after my talk, and he just sort of said, well, what would you do with organizations like the ADL? And I think a little bit too flippantly, actually much too flippantly, I said I would dismantle it. Actually, the ADL has functions which are genuinely useful. Reporting incidents of anti-Semitism gives us a clear picture of how bad things have gotten. Friends of mine tell me that the ADL works with law enforcement in the United States to track down potential, or anti-Semitic, violent anti-Semites before they have an opportunity to strike. And I think all of that, I should have been much clearer. I should not have suggested that all of that has to go. But to the extent that the ADL simply is in the work of trying to condemn Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or some of our other major anti-Semites here in the United States or anti-Semitic enablers, I think I just got to be candid. It's worse than useless. I mean, these are people, these anti-Semites are people who to some extent feed off of the condemnation and of groups like the ADL. I don't think it's actually serving the purposes of thriving Jewish life here in the United States. Build schools, build summer camps, send Jewish teenagers to Israel, give them a sense, invest them in the national debates, rather than ask them to be either fervent Zionists or anti-Zionists, but put them into the stream of Jewish life, and that's not really happening to a sufficient extent. And I'll just make one brief comment, Ben. 100 years ago in the United States, there was a thriving Swedish-American community in places like Minnesota with Swedish Lutheran churches, Swedish language newspapers. That is completely gone. And if American Jewry isn't careful, that is going to be the fate that befalls American Jewry, at least outside of its most orthodox elements. I think that would be a tragedy for the Jews. It would be a tragedy for the United States. So we have to change course to make sure that that's not our future as well.
Brett, I want to ask you two questions, if I may. The first one is, since 2007, after lecturing at countless universities in the United States, I was warning whomever was willing to listen from the American Jewish establishment that Jew hatred on campuses was on the rise. And that 15 years from then, those individuals who were activists on campus would be the elected officials, would be in the media, would be the thought leaders. Very few people recognized the danger that I was overtly warning about, consistently so. And I think that 15 years is now, it's today. And I say
that student you're talking about is Zoran Mamdani.
There you go.
At the time would have been an undergraduate at Bowdoin College or even a high school student.
Precisely, exactly emblematic of what I was warning about and the paradigmatic example of it. So what I want to know is, at the same time, I was meeting with individuals at Yad Vashem. The ADL was doing something similar in that they were saying, look, the threat to American Jewry per se is really on the decline. We're going to universalize our mission statement. We're going to be, in the case of Yad Vashem, a watchdog for genocides, reports for genocides anywhere and everywhere, not exclusively of the genocide against the Jews during the Holocaust. For the ADL, it became a watchdog against hatred writ large, not merely exclusively for the Jewish people. They were blind to the threats that were on the way. Do you think that the American Jewish establishment, whether it be those organizations I've mentioned or others, will they rise to this moment? You've given a very clear warning and a prescription. Will they be responsive in your view?
Well, let's see. And I mean, the ADL actually has moved in a positive direction in the sense that it is no longer so focused on a kind of a universalistic mission, and it has returned under Jonathan Greenblatt to its original mission, which was fighting anti-Semitism, not fighting sort of every form of hate in which anti-Semitism is just one component. But the problem that we have here is not simply the rise of anti-Semitism. The problem that we have is the rise of a set of ideas which I call anti-Semitic adjacent, right? So if you believe in intersectionality, that is not on its face an anti-Semitic idea, but it tends almost inexorably to lead to anti-Semitic conclusions. If you believe in this idea called privilege, and that privilege is evil, and the idea of privilege substitutes for the old-fashioned notion of American success, you're going to find your way towards anti-Semitism simply because the Jewish community has had a great deal of success here in the United States. So the fight that has to take place is really kind of in the broader cultural wars. What the Jewish people can do, right, is simply in every facet of Jewish life be excellent, do our own thing. I quote the great composer, Jewish composer, Philip Glass, who says, when there is no room at the table, build your own table. And Israel is the great example of a Jewish people that built their own table. I should point out that, to me, the most astounding fact of the last 2.5 years, in which Israel was not just subject to war on so many fronts, but to so much calumny worldwide, is to watch the Israeli economy continue to thrive, to watch companies continue to swoop in to buy Israeli unicorns and startups, to watch the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange go to unprecedented heights. It's because the country is making decisions for itself irrespective of what the rest of the world cares for it. And it's not bidding for the world's love, and it is increasingly indifferent to the world's hate. And I think that has a lot to do with some of the good decisions you have been able to make over in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, because those are decisions that aren't dictated by whether or not Israel or the Jews are winning someone else's popularity contest.
Well, Bret Stephens, thank you so very much. Let's hope that your prescriptions will be taken, and let's hope that in time, the next time, there's an anti-Semitic candidate running for the mayorship of New York, 33% of Jews don't, in a muddled fashion, find their way to supporting that individual. I always appreciate speaking to you. Thank you for putting front and center the mind shift that the American Jewish community must make. It's ultimately for our benefit. And I look forward to you joining us in the future again on Opinionated. Thank you.
I'd be delighted. Thank you.
Joining me now in studio is former AP chief for the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and elsewhere, Dan Perry. Dan, welcome to Opinionated.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Dan, I want to talk to you about the entry that we've seen of the Palestinian Authority into the Gaza Strip. I wanted to know what your thoughts are about it. Remember that there were two war aims, as you know. One was to bring the hostages back, the other to topple Hamas and prevent them from presenting a threat to us at any point in the future. But escorting that was always the commitment that the Palestinian Authority could not be part of the next phase inside Gaza.
I always thought that that unspoken aim was unwise, because the reality in the world that we have to live in is that in the Palestinian territories, the three options are Israeli occupation, full occupation, and therefore administration of a hostile population, Hamas, or the Palestinian Authority. The argument of various spokespersons for the government always was that the Palestinian Authority is bad for a variety of reasons. They flirted with ridiculousness by claiming on occasion that the authority is even worse than Hamas. A little bit tragicomic. But the truth is that there's things wrong with the authority. My analogy would be that the authority is a broken leg, or perhaps both legs broken. Better than a fatal tumor. The authority is, given that it's part of the international umbrella and seeks legitimacy and seeks to have good relations with Israel, to a degree, is in a situation where leverage can be applied.
Are you familiar with the constitution that the Palestinian Authority has drafted and what's at the nub and the heart of how it wants to rule this new enclave that would be handed on a silver platter after so many of our soldiers have fallen?
You're obviously
we have so many
alluding to
amputees. I don't know whether you've read it or not. I don't know whether you've had occasion to do so. But first of all, the Palestinian Authority actively states that Jerusalem is its capital, and it goes on to state that a Palestinian entity were one to come about, were it to be converted from a phantom to reality, in my opinion, God forbid that we should see such a situation. It says that, quote, the state is committed to preserving its religious character and protecting its Islamic and Christian sanctities, as well as its legal, political, and historical status. Any measures to change its character or its historical identity are considered null and void according to international law. You'll notice that not a single word about the Jewish character. That seems like an organization that has profound enmity towards our existence.
The Jewish character of a future Palestine?
The Jewish character, including in Jerusalem, which is another part of the Constitution, it states very, very openly, Jerusalem will be the capital of a Palestinian state.
Okay. Do you know how many of the surrounding Arab countries are run as democracies with constitutions that are binding?
Zero.
Yeah. So why would Palestine be the first? I'm looking at the real world. With the real
hang on,
world.
Palestine, the state of Palestine that doesn't currently exist, to be clear, would be the first in this case to answer your question, because that is what the Board of Peace is seeking to bring about. It's saying that a Palestinian Authority will rule over a contiguous state, Judea and Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, which, by the way, you can't bring about without bifurcating north from south Israel. And at its heart, there will be a constitution and democratic conventions. That's the answer to that question. That's why
I am not expecting any of that to happen. In the real world, where I have to live at least, you have a series of bad choices, and you have to pick the least bad. So you can read from the Constitution all you want, but I know that my three choices are Hamas, permanent occupation, meaning the undermining of Israel as a Jewish democratic state, or to hope to work with the least imperfect of my existing Palestinian interlocutors.
Israel is stationed inside the Gaza Strip right now up to the yellow line. They're not occupying the Gazan people inside that area. The Gazan people are beyond that yellow line. That's where they are. I don't see there's any occupation whatsoever. And if there were an occupation, I would say that it's completely just and appropriate, especially after what occurred on October the 7th.
Without Hamas disarming. In the current situation, without Hamas disarming, Israel would be completely within its rights to maintain what is in effect a very large buffer zone between a Hamas-ruled area and Israel proper. I'm not calling that an occupation.
I actually think that if Israel readies itself to rout Hamas as it needs to do and still hasn't managed to do, correct, I actually think that we could see the relocation of the Gazans en masse voluntarily. I don't think that we only have the option of occupation or withdrawing and allowing the Palestinian Authority. And let me ask you just an issue of practicality, because you keep mentioning that. Do you think that the Palestinian Authority should be required to resile from this dreadful constitution before any discussions are brought about with any seriousness about them taking rule inside Gaza?
The Constitution currently is as a phantom as you call the Palestinian state. I wouldn't
look at how we slow walk
seek to
this
overcomplicate
situation.
Benjamin. Like you, I want certain things. I want a perfect world. In my actual world, I'd like to save lives right now. And by the way, the insistence on finding a perfect solution to the question who's going to rule the Palestinians is what prolonged the war, probably about a year and a half beyond what it needed to be, cost the lives of hostages.
If you speak about the safety of the Jewish people, I would remind you and everybody else that the Palestinian Authority was murdering us and blowing us to pieces until we ring-fenced ourselves away from it by way of the security barrier. Only thereafter
talking
did
about
they
20
renounce,
some years ago.
and only thereafter did they renounce violence. I have no faith that they can police Hamas. I have no faith that they can be an effective ruler inside the Gaza Strip. And I personally believe very strongly that not for this outcome did hundreds of our soldiers fall and die fighting Hamas in Gaza, and dozens of our soldiers lose their limbs, their arms, their legs, fighting Hamas inside Gaza, not for an outcome wherein that enclave is handed over to the Palestinian Authority.
Many of those deaths and much of that sacrifice could have been avoided about 1.5 years ago or more, certainly after the killing of Sinwar, with a very similar outcome, because I was predicting throughout that in the end, after enough time had passed, the world, or more correctly put, the U.S., would force Israel into a hostage for end-of-war deal, which is precisely what happened. But had it been done earlier,
we have to wrap.
Israel
we'll just have to say that I profoundly disagree. I don't think that the war was unduly prolonged, and I very much hope that the integration of the Palestinian Authority into Gaza is not something that will come about. I think there are better options. Dan Perry, thank you so very much for being with me here on Opinionated. I know that I'll have you back.
I would love to come back.
Thank you. Now, on another note, nearly 20 years ago, I began a university lecture series that saw me make well over 450 campus presentations. On college after college, I encountered anti-Israel students and professors alike, stridently opposed to Israel's very existence. And thus began my warning to American Jewish communities of the rapid rise of Jew hatred that was toxifying America's academic hellscape. I exhorted them to recognize that, quote, the students of today will be the policymakers of tomorrow. 10 to 15 years from now, they will be your elected officials and your thought leaders, and they are being educated in environments that are hostile toward Israel, even hostile toward the Jews, end quote. Zoran Mamdani is one such erstwhile student, and the 10 to 20 years later of which I spoke then, well, that is precisely where we are today. But I also recognize something else, the irrefutable through line between a strong Israel and a secure Jewish diaspora. One thing that rendered Jew haters reluctantly stymied was the realization that as long as Israel, the country, was secure, diaspora Jews would never be quite so homeless or quite so placeless as our pursuers historically need their victims to be. As I'd learned on the campuses, hatred toward diaspora Jewry long predated October the 7th, but it was latent, just waiting to pounce and devour, or at the very least enfeeble, diaspora Jewish life as we know it. Now, after October 7th, that hatred went from furtive to emboldened, and I, sadly, was wholly unsurprised. As Israel reeled along the ropes of the heptagonal ring in which it fought, salivating Jew haters reasoned that if the Jewish state was ripe for destruction, perhaps, just perhaps, the Jewish people might be prone to the very same. And so, adrenalized by Israel's plight, they hounded Jewish students, burned our synagogues, murdered our parishioners, and pilloried us in the docks of public opinion. They attacked us when we were weak and when we were vulnerable, and they were just like Amalek in that sense. And they have already hyenaed away and gorged upon hugely important conventions of diaspora Jewish life. But the danger with which we must grapple today is not that Jew hatred has become brazen. Rather, it is that those who hawk this ancient hatred now know that they may peddle their prejudice with fear of neither penalty nor punishment. And worst of all, as Mamdani's election demonstrated, Jew haters now understand that their bigotry may well be met with positive reward up to and including at the ballot box. Now, uncaged as they are today from any societal norms, we cannot anticipate the lengths to which these predators will go. Which brings me all the way back to that through line between what happens in Israel and what occurs throughout the Jewish world. There is one hand that Israel should immediately play in order to clamp the calumny of the global haters of Zion, regardless of the efforts of any board of peace. Israel must conclusively win the very war that unleashed these horrors. And that war is still far from when. Israel must destroy Hamas inside Gaza, not simply because Hamas are an enemy deserving only of complete destruction, but because absolute security of our state is an absolute prerequisite for the rehobbling of those who hound us overseas. Make no mistake about it, they take their lead from us. I say we lead them back into the darkness. Diaspora communities really do not want to know a Jewish existence in the absence of a strong Jewish state. They've had a glimpse of that, and that's been more than enough. We had better push on toward victory.